Chapter 6. A Woman's Womanliness. The Imperial Cherry Garden Party was fixed that year for the 21st of April, the day proving one of the most perfect of a perfect Japanese spring. Pearl had been prevented from attending both the spring parties that had taken place since her arrival. Therefore, though suffering from a certain depression of spirits, which, in spite of her efforts, to the contrary, possessed her at times, she found herself looking forward with considerable pleasure to the coming event. As a member of the Rawlinson family, she had a right to an invitation. She accompanied her cousins, and as they drove towards the Hammergården Palace, Mrs. Rawlinson's critical eyes rested admiringly on Pearl's beautiful face, and on the almost equal loveliness of her young niece seated opposite to her. Her heart swelled with natural pride as she complacently smoothed out the creases of the purple shot silk that in various forms and shapes had graced many an imperial garden party. "There's not the slightest doubt," she ejaculated, "but that my niece and my cousin will be the two of the prettiest and best dressed women at the party today. You are both of you, my dears, looking perfectly charming. Don't you agree with me, Tom? Come now, say something, you tiresome person. Pay your relatives a compliment for once in a way." Mr. Rawlinson opened his lazy eyes with somewhat of an effort. "Both Pearl and Amy are quite vain enough of their looks without any compliments from me," he grunted. "The only thing unusual that I observe about them today is that the things they are wearing on their heads look, if anything, a shade more absurd and grotesque than they do even on ordinary occasions. My dear Rosina, I do wish you would leave me alone, and make the proper use of your parasol, instead of employing it for the sole purpose of poking me in the ribs. It is bad enough to be dragged to this infernal garden party without being massacred before I get there." This last remark was accompanied with a twinkle in the very kindly eyes. Tom Rawlinson was somewhat of a rough diamond, and he affected a certain gruffness, both in speech and manner. His bark, however, was well known for being considerably worse than his bite, and many there were who could vouch for his open-handedness in their moments of distress and need, his ever-ready helpful generosity, and above all, the priceless treasure in this unfeeling world, a warm heart. Now, don't call the garden party names, my dear, just because you would prefer to be wasting this beautiful day in that stupid, stuffy office of yours. And, Amy, don't pay any attention to what your uncle says. Your hat is very pretty. I'm sure it ought to be, as nothing was considered good enough for your ladyship, but a fabrication from Paris. By the by, Pearl, do you know anything about Sir Ralph Nicholson? Is he still here? He never comes our way now. What's the matter with him? I have seen him once since his return, and he appeared considerably changed from the genial, pleasant fellow that I remember him." Both Pearl and Amy reddened at Mrs. Rawlinson's questions. Neither conscience was entirely free from guilt. "Yes," answered the former hesitatingly. "He is still here. He came to see me yesterday and said that he would be at the party today. But here we are," she added, as with a certain relief she saw the entrance to the palace gardens. "Oh, Pearl, isn't it lovely?" exclaimed Amy. "I never saw the cherry trees so beautiful as they are this year." They walked through the picturesque grounds, planted with the world-famed cherry tree, heavy with its fragrant mass of blossom. Interspersed was the graceful momiji or spring maple, clothed in its luxurious mantle of brilliant red, forming with the dark foliage of the lofty pines and the varied greens of rare and ancient trees in all their rich and perfect beauty. An enchanting contrast to the cloudless azure sky above. Pearl, for a moment, in her admiration of these beauties of nature, perfected by the cunning art of man, forgot to be anxious and unhappy. Her sweet face was no longer grave. Her eyes shone as, giving herself up to the enjoyment of the hour, she experienced the charm of gazing at the landscape glorified at that moment by glowing, brilliant sunshine, and scented by the delicate odour of a myriad faintly tinted, profusely clustering blooms. Her eyes revelled in the unrivalled beauty of these lovely grounds, and only when she arrived at the waiting place beneath the ancient and wide-spreading trees, and was quickly surrounded and greeted by her many friends, did she realize that she was there not merely to admire, but in her turn to be equally admired. She was in an animated conversation with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Belgian and Spanish chef de mission when Amy came up to her. "Fancy, Pearl," she exclaimed. "Baron de D'Anethan has just told me that Monsieur De Güldenfeldt is still away at Sendai and Hakodate and all sorts of out-of-the-way places. You are guilty of keeping him away like this," she added in a whisper. "He loves these functions as a rule, but no doubt he has forgotten all about you by this time. Men are strange animals. Talk about the fickleness and changeableness of women, indeed. Just look at the pronounced way Sir Ralph is flirting with that strong-minded looking female in magenta. Not that I care a bit, you know. Though I can't say I particularly admire his taste, do you?" And Amy's dark orbs flashed disdainfully. Pearl let her eyes travel in the directions indicated, and as she looked, a puzzled expression came into them. "I seem to know that face," she said musingly. "Where can I have seen it before?" She was still pondering when her thoughts were interrupted by a man's voice behind her inquiring in a strong foreign accent, "Madame Nugent, may I be allowed to have the honour of presenting an old friend of mine to you?" And turning, Pearl, with no previous warning of the ordeal before her, met Lord Martinworth face to face. The meeting was so unexpected, for she had gathered from Sir Ralph that it would still be some weeks before the Martinworth's arrival, that Pearl found herself murmuring commonplaces and mechanically bowing as she would have murmured and bowed to a complete stranger. Later on, she realized how dazed, how completely lost she had been at the moment. It was only on perceiving the deathly pallor of the face before her that she remembered that she was in public, that 1,000 eyes were upon her, and with a supreme effort she partially succeeded in recovering her presence of mind. Lord Martinworth had been standing conversing with Count Carletti, a member of one of the foreign legations and a former acquaintance whom he had unearthed in Tokyo, when the latter caught sight of Pearl's tall figure and straight back, clad in a perfectly cut gown. He had already announced himself as one of her many admirers, though having only lately arrived in Japan, he was unacquainted as yet with the gossip of his new post. Always talking himself and never giving another a chance to put in a word, he was so far in ignorance of Mrs. Nugent's history. He had heard vaguely that she was separated from her husband, a fact which he considered much in her favour, for in the opinion of this vivacious gentleman, every pretty woman profited much. Certainly, as far as he personally was concerned, in being placed in a position more or less irregular or equivocal. At any rate, if unfortunately a husband did happen to exist, the more such an inconvenient appendage remained in the background, the greater approval was the lady of the air likely to find in Count Carlitti's soft brown eyes. Those eyes were ever on the lookout for a pretty face or a rounded bust. His taste in female beauty was considered, certainly by himself, if by no one else, indisputable. So when at the club he had once again given out that there was no doubt whatsoever but that Mrs. Nugent was a la plus belle femme de Tokyo. No one troubled, even if they disagreed, to contradict one who counted himself such an experienced judge of the correct and classic lines of feminine loveliness. "I must, mon ami," he said to Martinworth, "present you to the un but, mais un but incomparable. Madame Nugent is English. You see that beautiful straight back and little head poised so haughtily? Ah, I perceive you admire. But wait, mon ami, till you see her face, and when you will have seen her face, wait a little longer till you have seen her en robe de beau, que je peux, mon cher. Ah, que je peux. Then tell me if we do not possess a gem in ce triste Tokyo." The introduction promptly followed, and shortly afterwards Count Carlitti was heard relating that la parfaite beauté de cette Madame Nugent had made such an impression on ce brave Martinworth that he had actually trembled and turned ashen from the violence of his emotions. "My triumph is complete," he was saying to Tom Spence, a junior member of the English legation. "C'était le coup de foudre." "Coup de foudre, by Jove! I should just think it must have been," exclaimed Spence. "Why, my dear fellow, Martinworth is the very man with whom Mrs. Nugent, that's not her real name, you know, was mixed up within that divorce suit 2 or 3 years ago. She came out here, they say, to get rid of him. And now you go and introduce them to each other as if they had never met before. Ha ha ha! Upon my word, that's the best joke, the rummest situation I have ever heard of." "Mon Dieu!" exclaimed Carlitti, with a shrug of his shoulders. "If women change their names, how is it possible to know the right, what do you call it, correspondence that belong to them? Mais sapristi, quelle guigne!" "What is the matter, Count?" asked Lady Thompson, who, with her husband, the English minister, at that moment joined the two young men. "You look quite upset. An unusual state of things for you." "Carlitti has just been distinguishing himself by introducing Lord Martinworth to Mrs. Nugent," explained the amused Spence. He evidently wished for a sensation. The British minister was a very dignified person, and no one realized better than His Excellency himself that he was assisting in a prominent position at an important court function. At his secretary's words, however, he screwed up his mouth into the form of a button, and a sound very like a whistle issued from his lips. "My dear Carlitti, what a terrible situation! You mean to say you didn't know about the divorce and all the rest of it?" "Mais naturellement, Monsieur le Ministre, je n'en sais rien. I desire to make a pleasure to mon ami Martinworth, for he knows himself well un but de femme, and I was assured that he would admire la belle Madame Nugent. Après tout, j'avais raison, je connais bien son goût." "Yes, you are quite right, Count," murmured the English wife of one of the German secretaries. equally remarkable for her extreme prettiness, her sharp tongue, and her very many indiscretions. Lord Martinworth certainly knows something about the good points of le beau sexe. As for Mrs. Nugent, he has had in her case, I'm told, many years of leisure in London to study this particular example. Well, now he can recommence, and can still further improve himself in what you dear, foolish men tell us is an absorbing and inexhaustible occupation, the study of the female heart. Dear Mrs. Nugent's heart must be so very, very interesting. It is a pity that, so far, this boring, dull Tokyo has never provided her with an adorer to help to solve its mysteries. Don't, I pray you, waste your pity where it is not required, my dear little Countess, laughed Lady Thompson. Mrs. Nugent could have had, I feel assured, as many adorers as she desired. But you know as well as I do that in spite of her somewhat difficult position, she does not lay herself out for admiration and that sort of thing. She is certainly not a bit of a flirt. By the by, she added the sotto voce to her husband. Do you think I ought to say anything to her about that horrid man's death and the fortune? Or shall I ignore the whole subject? What do you think about it? By all means, hold your tongue, replied the cautious diplomatists. To refer to the fellow's death would be in the worst possible taste. Why, I see she doesn't even wear mourning, and quite right, too. It would be the height of hypocrisy. Come along, my dear, collect the wives of my secretaries and those other ladies whom it is your duty to introduce to the Empress, for it will soon be our turn to be received in audience. We must take our place. For the rest of that afternoon, Count Carletti retired into the background, and this usually volatile gentleman was extremely silent and considerably suppressed. Allowing for a certain amount of exaggeration, the description he gave Tom Spence of Lord Martinworth's demeanour at the moment of introduction was far from being incorrect. If, instead of bounding away after someone else, Carletti had remained a little longer on the spot, his surprise would have been greatly increased by hearing the one word, Pearl, issuing in deep, astounded tones from men's lips, and by witnessing the intense look of joy that, after the first shock of amazement, illuminated the handsome but somewhat stern features. To show emotion at an unexpected meeting, neither words nor violent outbursts of excitement are necessary. Lord Martinworth and Pearl Nugent met, and had at one glance recognized each other. She had let her trembling hand lie in his for a moment, while that one look, that one word, had passed between them. She could not have spoken if her life had depended on the opening of her lips. And she felt it indeed a cause of thankfulness when the court chamberlains chose that moment to divide the crowd, forming it into two lines facing each other, and when in the necessary confusion, Martinworth was separated from her side. The Corps Diplomatique took up their stand in line by order of precedence, the rest of the crowd placing themselves beyond and behind where they could obtain the best view. The military bands repeated one after the other the very solemn and impressive national anthem, while the imperial majesties, accompanied by the princes and princesses of the blood and all the court, walked slowly by the between two lines of their respectful subjects, and that of the Corps Diplomatique, acknowledging graciously the deferential salutations of this large gathering of people. Immediately on the passing of the court, the Corps Diplomatique took their place in the procession. The crowds of guests followed, and Pearl found herself leaning heavily on Nicholson's arm. walking in a sort of trance across the picturesque bridges and along the lovely verdure-shaded paths. Ralph had been an anxious and interested spectator of the meeting between his two friends. He was exchanging banalities with Lady Martinworth, the recollection of whose face had proved so great a puzzle to Pearl. When he had observed the greeting, and his kind heart had beaten sympathetically at what he knew must indeed be a terrible ordeal to both. He witnessed Pearl's sudden dismay, the dazed and frightened look, and the nervous clutch of the handle of her parasol. Unceremoniously deserting his companion, he made his way towards Mrs. Nugent, and when everyone started to follow in the procession, he, without a word, simply drew her arm through his, holding her up through all that long and silent promenade. When the imperial party at length arrived at the marquee prepared for them, and the crowd was waiting expectantly on the turf outside, Ralph succeeded in obtaining a chair for his companion. Pearl by this time had regained a certain amount of control, and was so far composed that she could watch with interest their Imperial Majesties receiving the members of the Corps Diplomatique, and accepting the various presentations that are made to them on these occasions. While this ceremony was still proceeding, Amy Mendovi, occupied with her own affairs, and all unconscious of the event that had just taken place, came up to her cousin. "You lucky woman," she said, "to have got a chair. I'm simply dead with fatigue." "But Pearl," she added, struck with her cousin's pallor and gazing at her with anxiety, "how terribly pale you look. Are you not well, dear?" Mrs. Nugent felt the sun a little. "I have persuaded her to sit down," replied Nicholson, who with open parasol was still standing guard over Pearl. Amy raised her eyebrows, and instead of glancing at him, gazed somewhat superciliously down her straight nose. She was feeling deeply offended with Ralph. He had not approached her the whole of that day, and as she had confessed to Pearl, had indeed scarcely honoured her with his society at home or abroad, since the memorable piano incident. Ralph Nicholson was following strictly to the letter Pearl's advice, and was feeling extremely pleased with himself in consequence. After all, what clever creatures women are, he thought. Now, unless it had been put into my dull head, I should never have dreamt of this very easy plan of getting round the little witch. I should simply either have cut it, or else, like an idiot, have rushed off and proposed again. Either of which proceedings would, according to Mrs. Nugent, have proved fatal to my chances. Now I see my lady is just wild with me. She won't even look at me. She saw me at work, though, as I intended she should do, on that queer fish, Lady Martinworth, who, by the by, is not half a bad sort, and capital company to boot. Tant mieux, Miss Mendovi. Your punishment will last considerably longer, I can tell you. Thus thought Ralph, as he stood at the back of Pearl's chair, complacently twirling his moustache, and furtively watching the lady of his dreams. He found her looking more charming, more seductive than ever today, in her pretty gown and extremely becoming hat. Her dark eyes were flashing, the rich colour in her cheeks was coming and going with suppressed excitement. As completely ignoring Nicholson's presence, she bent down and wrapped a lace scarf around Pearl's shoulders. "I think," said Sir Ralph, this time addressing himself to Pearl, "if you will excuse me, Mrs. Nugent, as you have Miss Mendovi with you now, and as I see many of your acquaintances making their way towards you, I will just go and give Lady Martinworth a look. I see her casting signals of distress. She knows no one here in all this crowd, you know, and she's awfully nice." So with a grin and a parting glance at the back of Amy's dark head, off he went. Pearl watched him go. Then she looked at Amy, who had turned with apparently great animation to address one of her numerous admirers hard by. I hope, she thought, he won't overact it. Men can never do things by halves, and of course two can play at that game. The truth of which remark Miss Mendovey was determined to prove, for during the rest of the afternoon she succeeded in attaching to her charming person a by no means unworthy suitor, a certain good-looking secretary of legation who long had been known to sigh hopelessly for her hand. Pearl never quite recalled how she got through the rest of the ceremony. Afterwards, she remembered vaguely catching a somewhat distant view of their imperial majesties seated at a table within the tent, discussing their repast in solitary grandeur. Near them were placed the imperial princess and princesses, and beyond were little tables at which were seated the ministers of state and the members of the Corps Diplomatique, with their wives and families. She had a dim recollection of someone forcing her to swallow a fragment of pâté de foie gras and a glass of champagne, and she once remembered raising her eyes and finding those of Lady Martinworth fixed with a look of mocking inquiry and scrutiny upon her face. This expression on Lady Martinworth's countenance was an additional shock to the many that Pearl was fated to experience that afternoon. Fortunately, shortly after this incident, the imperial party broke up, thereby allowing the guests the liberty to take their departure, all the long strain on Pearl's nerves and the dread that Martinworth would again approach her would inevitably have culminated in a breakdown. As it was, her first action on reaching the shelter of her home was a characteristic one of her sex. She shut herself into her drawing room, and walking straight up to the glass over the mantelpiece, she gazed at herself for fully 2 minutes. In spite of the pallor of her cheeks, this close examination apparently did not prove otherwise than satisfactory, for there was a slight smile about the lips as she drew the long pins from her hat and laid her head back on the pillows of the sofa. She was anxious to collect her thoughts, and if possible to devise some plan for the immediate future. Whether that plan would ever have been formed, it is difficult to say. As it was, her cogitations were speedily interrupted by the simple fact of a violent ring at the doorbell. Pearl was on her feet in an instant, and her hand was pressed against her heart to still its beating. Who could it be? Was it? Yes, it must be Martinworth, who had probably ascertained without difficulty her whereabouts and had lost no time in following her. She experienced a strange sensation, a mixture of disappointment and relief, when she realized it was not Martinworth's voice, but a woman's, that she heard in a hall. The next moment, Lady Martinworth entered the room. She made a considerable noise as she strode with long steps towards Pearl, who was standing erect with a slight look of defiance in her wide-open eyes. "How do you do, Mrs. Norrywood?" she exclaimed, holding out a large hand. "I saw you at the garden party, easily found out where you lived, and thought it best to come on here without delay to have a necessary yarn with you. No objection, I suppose, to my bearding you in your den like this?" she added, with a broad, decidedly good-natured smile. Pearl drew herself up and threw her head back in a manner peculiar to herself. She felt completely mistress of her actions, quite ready for the fray, as she answered calmly, "Before proceeding further in our interview, Lady Martinworth," the name stuck in her throat, "I think it best that you should be aware that I am known here under the name of Nugent. Will you not sit down?" "Thanks. Oh, so you have changed your name," was the reply. "Well, perhaps it is just as well in the circumstances." "I'm glad it meets with your approval. May I offer you a cup of tea, or perhaps a cigarette? You smoke, I believe." "Thanks. Yes, I smoke." "Oh, Egyptians, I see. Fearfully doctored, you know. Couldn't think of a drinking tea. I ate enough of that spread this afternoon to last me for a week. Pretty sight, but I was dying to get away to have a smoke, and now, like a good Samaritan, you have come to my rescue." Another broad smile. Then followed a silence which Pearl for one was determined not to break. Lady Martinworth threw herself back in her chair, stuck her feet out before her, and made rings with the cigarette smoke. "Pretty place, this Tokyo. Been here long?" at length she ejaculated. "I have lived here rather more than 3 years," replied Pearl quietly. "Have you come to see me for the purpose of obtaining some information about the place or the people?" "Nothing further from my thoughts, I assure you. You like it better than London, I suppose. Uncommonly dull place to live in, though, I should think, but no accounting for tastes. I didn't know you were here, you know, or of course I shouldn't have been such a brute as to have come to Japan and disturbed your peace of mind." Pearl slightly lifted her eyebrows and looked her companion straight in the face. "And may I inquire," she asked suavely, "in what possible way you would be likely to do that?" Lady Martinworth tossed her cigarette into the grate, and, rising from her armchair, went and perched herself on the music stool. "In bringing Martinworth here, attached to my apron strings, of course. Hard luck on you both, I call it. Not very pleasant for me either, you know. Why, he'll detest me more than ever now, which is saying a good deal." Pearl seated herself in a chair near the music stool on which her visitor was twirling herself round and round, accompanied by that teeth-edging squeak with which music stools seem chronically to be affected. She laid her hand on the stool to try to stop the movement. "Lady Martinworth," she said, "do you not think it would be wiser for us to both to keep Lord Martinworth's name out of this conversation? He and I are old friends. We meet again after some years, and we—" "Oh, I say," interrupted her companion rudely. "Stop that. I don't want a long jobation about your and Martinworth's friendship, you know. I know all about that. Read the whole case from the beginning to the end with the greatest interest. I made up my mind years ago to marry Dick, but of course everyone knew he was otherwise engaged, and when you got your divorce, it was given out that he would marry you. And so he would have done if you had not bolted like the little idiot you were. Well, 'tis an ill wind that blows no one any good. You no sooner made yourself scarce than I seized my opportunity. I needn't tell you, he never asked me to marry him. I saved him that trouble. And here I am, Lady Martinworth, whereas you are— by the way, by what outlandish name did you say you called yourself?" Pearl rose and calmly went towards the door, which she threw open. "Lady Martinworth," she said, very slowly and very icily, "no doubt my education has been sadly neglected, but I must confess, in private matters of this kind, I have only been accustomed to dealing with ladies. As therefore it is absolutely impossible for me to cope with a person of your caliber. I must beg of you to do me the favour of leaving my house directly." But Lady Martinworth did not stir from her seat. On the contrary, the eternal smile grew broader on the somewhat homely features. She took a single eyeglass from the breast pocket of her coat and, rubbing it with a silk handkerchief, stuck it calmly into her left eye, gazing meanwhile complacently at Pearl. "Bravo, bravo," she exclaimed, clapping her hands. "You really did that very well, you know. What an actress you would make, with your figure and grand air. No wonder Martinworth fell in love with you. I admire his excellent taste. Upon my word, I do. Poor old fellow, it is hard lines on him that after having been your slave for so long, he should now have to fall back on me. Never mind, we won't talk about him if you don't like it. Do be a sensible woman. Come and sit down and leave that door to take care of itself. I'm not going just yet, you know, for I have something I want to say to you." Much to her own astonishment, Pearl found herself obediently following her ladyship's request. She closed the door and came once more and sat down by her side. If she had been asked to do so, she could not have defined her sentiments towards this strange woman, who, all unbidden, had forced herself into her presence. Coarse, utterly wanting in tact and delicacy as she seemed to be, there was something about her very honesty and good nature that attracted Pearl. She found herself trying to analyze her companion's character, wondering what there was in it, and in the situation altogether, that was tending to change her sentiments towards her visitor. Was it sympathy, she asked herself, a feeling of sorrow that was now taking possession of her? She answered gently, "Forgive me for my brusqueness. If there is anything you wish to say to me, I shall be willing to listen to you. Can I be of use to you in any way?" Without a moment's hesitation, Lady Martinworth rose from her seat and clasped Pearl's two hands. "Yes," she said, "you can be of great use to me if you will. You can be my friend. Will you?" There was no reply, for Pearl was deeply considering this extraordinary request. What did it mean? Was the woman sincere? Or was it merely a clever move on her part to secure the alliance of a person who otherwise might be an impediment, a dangerous rival? The ups and downs of a stormy existence had developed in Pearl a certain mistrustfulness, a suspiciousness of disposition, otherwise unnatural to her. And considering the circumstances of the case, she felt in no wise inclined to jump at this unexpected proposal. While she was debating in her mind what reply to make, Lady Martinworth spoke again. "Well, I see you don't like the notion," she said, moving towards the window. "Why should you? I suppose you and I have not an idea or a taste in common. I have never had a woman friend in my life, and have never wanted to have one. Till now I have always looked on women as poor creatures. But somehow you seem different from the rest. I like the way you went to that door and wanted to turn me out. Real plucky, I call it, and one so seldom sees pluck in a woman. Then the way you left it when I asked you to do so showed me you had a heart, for I saw you were feeling sorry for me. I've got a heart too, whatever you may think of me. Yes, Mrs. Nugent, I've got a heart, one that is full of love for my husband too, though he little knows it." As Lady Martinworth uttered these last words, she might have been called almost pretty. A wonderfully tender light lit up the small eyes, and the white mouth smiled very sweetly as she continued. "And that is just it. That is just why I asked you to be my friend. I love my husband. He doesn't care a rap about me, you know. No, not one little bit. In fact, I know there are times when he downright detests me. I well know he's just as devoted to you as ever he was. Of course he has adored you for years. You are a good woman, I know you are, in spite of that nasty speech I made about the divorce case. With your pretty face and unhappy married life, you must of course have had heaps of temptations, and yet as I look at you, I feel convinced you have always kept as straight as a die. You have got such a nice, true eyes. Yes, upon my word, I like you, Mrs. Nugent. I feel you are a trump, and it would make me thoroughly happy if you would do me the kindness of calling me your friend. Cannot you make an effort in that direction? Do try. I know I'm not a very attractive person, but one thing I swear to you, I'm neither mean nor petty. And I'm sure that, so far, I have never willingly done a shabby action. Of course, those qualities are not much to boast of, but they are all I possess, so I enumerate them. And I do so want a friend. Oh, I do so want a friend. At these words, Lady Martinworth suddenly hid her face in her hands and burst into a flood of tears. Pearl began to think there was to be no end to the surprises of that day. Now behold, as a climax to every excitement, Lady Martinworth, succumbing, like any other member of her sex, to an hysterical attack of nerves. It was this womanly, weak action that conquered Pearl, and if Lady Martinworth had but known it, she could not have chosen better tactics to have achieved her ends. Pearl understood that in spite of those mannish ways and the abrupt speech, in spite of the general roughness and uncouthness, in spite of all these outward traits that on ordinary occasions would have gone so far towards repelling a gentle nature such as her own, that nevertheless she had there, seated in her house in the abandonment of grief, a friendless, miserable woman, with a woman's heart and a woman's weakness. Realizing this, Pearl kissed her and put her arms about her, as only a woman knows how to kiss and soothe, and comfort another of her sex. Half an hour later, a grateful and transformed Lady Martinworth departed from Mrs. Nugent's house, and Pearl was left once more to her thoughts. Poor Pearl! They could hardly be reckoned pleasant thoughts. She perfectly well understood that she was being entangled in a net, that net of circumstances which is oftentimes so strangely and so strongly woven that to the unfortunate victim entrapped within, there appears no possible loophole of escape. She thought of this interview just past and asked herself, where would it lead her? An hour ago, she considered herself the natural enemy of the wife of the man she loved. Now, to her bewilderment, she found she had vowed eternal friendship and protection to this woman, who, in the usual order of things, according to all natural laws, she ought to treat, if not with great dislike, certainly with fear, avoidance, and distrust. And yet, strange to say, she did not in the least regret her action, for she pitied with all her heart the woman who, in such a genuine outburst of grief, had prayed for her friendship. All the chivalry of Pearl's generous nature was aroused when she thought of this poor friendless, heartbroken woman crying to her for help. To her, who, from Lady Martinworth's own confession, was still the sole recipient of Dick Martinworth's love. Lady Martinworth had thrown herself, as it were, on her protection, and Pearl then and there vowed to herself that as far as it lay in her power, as far as strength would be given her to carry out her intentions, she would not prove her false. She had, she knew well, a difficult task before her, and she did not disguise from herself the fact that in this matter there would be not only herself, not only her own strength, her own endurance to be reckoned with, but Martinworth, from whom she had fled, and who was here once more on the spot. He knew his power, and he would surely use it. Of that she had no doubt. Her dread of that power, of that determination of will, was as great now as had been the case in former years. After all, as she had written on herself in her farewell letter at that time, she was but a woman, a helpless, loving woman, weak and frail. On that occasion, when she had thought, rightly or wrongly, her disappearance was for his benefit, her love had given her the almost superhuman strength to fly from him. Now she had only herself to think of, and one other forlorn woman, a stranger, who had prayed to her for help. Could she hope to be given a second time the power to resist his undeniable influence over her? Could she resist his importunities, his prayers? He was so strong, so very strong, and she was so loving, so lonely and so weak. Again the bell rang. This time it was Lord Martinworth who entered the room, and with his arrival Pearl knew that her resolutions, her force of will, would be put straight away to the test.